Allow yourself right now to settle a little more deeply into whatever is holding you. Feel the weight of your body against the surface beneath you, and let that weight be a gift. You do not have to hold yourself up tonight. Something else is doing that for you. Simply breathe. In through the nose slowly, filling the low part of your chest first, then the middle, then the top. Hold it for just a moment, and then let it go all at once, like setting down something you've been carrying for too long. Good. We begin here, at the end of your day, and we travel somewhere very old. The world you're about to enter is not a gentle one, but it is a true one, in the way that only stories told in the dark ever managed to be true, and the man at the centre of this story, the man with white hair and cat's eyes and 2 swords on his back, was never supposed to exist at all. Not in the way the world had arranged itself, not in the way fate had sketched the outline of things. He arrived anyway, and the world never quite recovered from the fact of him. Before there was Geralt of Rivia, before there were witches at all, before even the roads that connected one frightened village to the next, the world itself had to be broken, and it was, catastrophically, irrevocably, in the way that only truly foundational events manage to break things, down to the level of what is possible and what is not. The event is called the conjunction of the spheres. Let that phrase rest in your mind for a moment without rushing past it. The conjunction of the spheres. Imagine reality not as a single solid thing, but as many spheres, many worlds, each spinning in its own pocket of existence, separated from the others by something too subtle for any instrument to measure. That was how things were. Multiple worlds, each containing its own forms of life, its own rules, its own histories, none of them aware of the others except perhaps as the vaguest intuition, a feeling that somewhere, on the other side of something, other things were happening. Then, approximately 1,500 years before Geralt was born, those spheres collided. The mechanism of this collision is not fully understood by the scholars and mages who study it, and that is perhaps appropriate, because the events that remake worlds tend to resist clean explanation. What is known is the consequence. The barriers between realities shattered. Multiple worlds, multiple populations, multiple sets of natural and unnatural laws crashed into one another in a single catastrophic overlap. And when the spheres separated again, they did not separate cleanly. Things were left behind. Creatures that had never evolved to live in this world, that had developed under entirely different conditions on entirely different planes of existence, suddenly found themselves stranded here. Monsters, the later inhabitants of this world would call them, though that word carries a moral judgment that the creatures themselves did nothing to invite. They were simply life, shaped by different rules, placed without consent into an environment that did not understand them and that they did not understand. There were also 2 other things the conjunction deposited into this world. The first was magic, or more precisely the capacity for magic. Before the conjunction, this world had no magic. That is a strange sentence to sit with. A world without magic, but every place has a before. After the conjunction, the world was saturated with a force that practitioners would come to call chaos, a raw, impersonal energy that suffused the air and the earth, and could, with sufficient training and sufficient sacrifice, be shaped and directed by those beings sensitive enough to feel it. The second thing the conjunction introduced was humanity. This is perhaps the most startling fact in all of the continent's deep history, and it deserves a moment of stillness. Sit with it for just a breath. The human beings who had come to dominate this world who would build its kingdoms and wage its wars and tell its stories and eventually produce a witcher named Geralt, were not native to it. They arrived through the conjunction just as the monsters did. They were, in the most technical sense, invasive. They were, in every meaningful sense, survivors. The world the humans found was already inhabited. The Aen-Seidr, the elves, had lived here for millennia before the conjunction. They had built civilizations of extraordinary refinement, had developed their own relationship with the land and with magic, had organized themselves into communities of deep cultural complexity. The dwarves, too, had been here, carving their cities from mountain rock with a patience that the younger races would never quite replicate. The gnomes, the halflings, each of the elder races had their roots in this soil in ways that the newly arrived humans simply did not. And yet it was the humans who expanded fastest, who cleared forests and planted fields and built towns at a pace that the elder races found simultaneously baffling and alarming. Humans reproduced quickly. They innovated without sentiment. They did not mourn the old arrangements of the land the way the elves did, because they had no memory of those arrangements. They arrived without a past, and so they were freed from its weight in a way that made them genuinely dangerous, not out of malice, but simply out of the profound capability that comes from having nothing to lose. The elves called humans Aen Ithlinaspeith, a phrase that translates roughly as destiny's children, and the name was not entirely a compliment. It acknowledged something the elves observed in the newcomers, a strange insistence on mattering, a refusal to accept the modest role that latecomers might reasonably have been expected to play. Humans did not come in quietly and occupy the margins. They arrived and immediately began to act as though the world had been waiting for them. The centuries that followed the conjunction were centuries of compression and conflict. Humans pushed outward from their initial settlements along the coasts and river valleys, pressing into forest territories and mountain passes that the elder races had long considered their own. Wars were fought, many of them, though history tends to remember only the decisive ones. Accommodations were reached, some of them lasting, most of them not. Humans became the dominant species not through any single act of conquest, but through the relentless arithmetic of expansion and reproduction, each generation consuming more space than the one before. And throughout all of this, the monsters persisted. This is something that requires careful understanding, because it shapes everything that follows, including the existence of witches, including the existence of Geralt himself. The creatures stranded here by the conjunction did not disappear when humans began to dominate the landscape. They retreated, some of them, into the deeper wilderness, into the marshes and the high mountains and the ancient forests where human settlement had not yet reached. But they did not vanish, and where human civilization advanced, the boundaries between the settled world and the monster-inhabited wilderness became not a clear line but a contested and frequently lethal threshold. Farmers were killed, travellers disappeared on roads between towns, livestock was taken in the night by things that left tracks no one could identify. Children went into the forest and did not return, though we will not dwell in that darkness tonight. The point is not the violence itself, but the logic it created, a logic that said, if monsters exist and cannot be wished away, then someone must be capable of confronting them, and if ordinary soldiers and guards were not sufficient, which they often were not, then what was needed was something that had been specifically made for that purpose. What was needed was something between a man and a monster. Something that had been altered enough to survive what monsters could do, trained enough to understand what monsters were, and detached enough from ordinary human life that it could walk into the dark places and come back out again without breaking under the weight of what it had seen there. What was needed, the world eventually decided, was a Witcher. But that institution, and the man who would become its most famous product, would not arrive for many centuries yet. First, the world had to settle into the shape it would hold when Geralt was born into it. The kingdoms of the north had to form, with their complicated politics and their uneasy truces and their long memories of grievances. Nilfgaard had to rise in the south, patient and ambitious, the kind of empire that expands not through passion, but through method. Magic had to be organized into academies and shaped into a profession, so that the raw chaos of the conjunction could be disciplined into something teachable and something dangerous in an organized way. Let yourself drift now, just slightly, into this ancient world. The air smells of pine smoke and river water. The nights are genuinely dark here, the kind of dark that city lights have made most people forget. The stars above the continent are extraordinary, crowded and brilliant, unmarked by any of the constellations you know, organized instead into the shapes that this world's astronomers named for its own myths and histories. Somewhere in that darkness, something moves through the tree line at the edge of a village. Something that is not quite right. Something that has been here longer than the village has. And somewhere, not yet born, not yet imagined, not yet even possible in the form he will eventually take, the man who will one day be called Geralt of Rivia is waiting. The world is preparing itself very slowly for someone it does not yet know it needs. Let your breath slow to match the pace of that preparation. There is no hurry here. The oldest stories always take their time. The elder races watched human expansion the way that old trees might observe a fire moving across a hillside, with the slow recognition of something that cannot be stopped and the particular grief of witnessing the diminishment of what was familiar. The Anceda did not disappear, but they contracted, retreating into the deeper forests and the older mountain valleys, the places that human agriculture found less useful and therefore left alone longer. The dwarves did something similar in the mountains, where their mines and their cities continued to function with a pragmatic industriousness that allowed them to exist alongside human expansion rather than simply being displaced by it. But the terms of their existence had changed permanently, and they knew this, and the knowledge lived in the culture of both peoples in ways that would take centuries to express themselves fully in the politics of the continent. The monsters that remained were not uniformly dangerous in the same ways. Some were territorial but not aggressive unless provoked. Others were predators in the simple ecological sense, hunting for food rather than from malice, which did not make their hunting less lethal to the people they encountered, but did change the nature of what needed to be understood about them. A witcher, encountering a katakan or a vampire, was dealing with something organized around different survival imperatives than a witcher encountering a fiend or a golem, and the difference mattered practically in terms of how the encounter should be approached and what outcome was actually possible. Magic, as it developed in the centuries following the conjunction, became one of the most significant organizing forces in human society. The mages who emerged from the academies at Aretuza and Banard and Oxenfurt did not merely advise the nobility. They shaped the political landscape in ways that were sometimes visible through the dramatic applications of magical power in warfare and crisis, and sometimes invisible through the quieter work of counsel and manipulation that took place in the rooms adjacent to the rooms where official decisions were made. The relationship between magical ability and political power was intimate and complicated and never quite resolved itself into a stable arrangement, because the interests of mages and the interests of rulers were never identical, and the difference always mattered eventually. There is a particular quality to the light on the continent in the hours just before dawn, when the sky has moved from the deep black of true night to the dark blue that precedes the first grey of morning. In this light, the old stone of castles and town walls takes on a colour that is almost silver, and the roads, which in daylight are mud and ruts and the accumulated evidence of heavy use, become smooth and mysterious, and full of an anticipatory quiet that the bustle of the coming day will shortly erase. This is the hour when the continent is most itself, before the human activity that defines it during the waking hours has fully reasserted itself, when the land remembers what it was before the conjunction deposited all of this complexity upon it. The season in which the conjunction occurred is not recorded in any source reliable enough to cite with confidence, but the folklore of multiple cultures on the continent places it in autumn, in the harvest season, when the year is already turning toward darkness and the boundaries between the world and whatever lies beyond it are at their most permeable. Whether this placement is accurate or whether it reflects the cultural intuition that the most significant ruptures in the fabric of reality would naturally occur when the fabric is already loosening. The autumn conjunction association runs through the folklore of elder and human cultures alike, and surfaces in the festivals and observances that mark the turning of the year across the breadth of the continent. Breathe in again, slowly, and let your body remember where it is. The bed, the floor, the air around you, all of it real and safe and yours. Hold that sense of safety for just a moment, because the place we're going to now is cold and old and not particularly given to comfort. But there is a beauty to it, the kind of beauty that belongs to things that have endured, and by the time we leave it, you will understand something essential about the man at the centre of this story. Breathe out. We go together. Kaer Morhen sits in the Blue Mountains in the far northeast of the continent, in a region so remote and so seasonally inaccessible that for most of the year it belongs entirely to itself. The pass that leads to it, the Gwenlech River Valley climbing steeply through pine forest and scree, is navigable only during the warmer months. By the time the first hard snows arrive, the fortress and everyone within it is sealed away from the rest of the world as completely as if they had descended beneath the surface of a lake. If you have ever been somewhere so quiet that you could hear your own blood moving, you have some approximation of Kaer Morhen in deep winter. The name means old fortress in the elder speech, which tells you something about the age of the place and about who named it. It was not built by witchers. It was acquired by them, claimed as a base of operations in the early centuries of the Witcher institution, a structure already old when the first mutated monster hunters moved in and began making it their own. The stonework of its oldest sections dates to elven construction, and there are places in the deep basement levels where the carvings in the rock walls belong to a tradition no living scholar fully understands anymore. The fortress has outlasted the people who built it, as the best fortresses tend to do. The School of the Wolf, which is what the Kaer Morhen Witcher Brotherhood calls itself, was not the only school of witches in the continent's history, but it became the most significant, partly through circumstance and partly through the particular approach to mutation and training its founders developed. Other schools existed at their height: the School of the Cat, the School of the Bear, the School of the Griffin, the School of the Viper, each with its own fortress, its own medallion, its own variations on the mutations and combat philosophy that made witches what they were. Most of those schools no longer exist in any meaningful sense. The wolf endures, if barely. the founding of the Witcher institution, is attributed to a mage named Cosimo Malaspina, though Witcher records from that period are fragmentary, and the attribution is contested by scholars who prefer different names. What is certain is that the institution arose from a specific problem that the expansion of human civilization had created: the proliferation of dangerous creatures at the edges of the settled world, and the corresponding demand for specialists capable of dealing with them. The mages who developed the first Witcher mutations were attempting to engineer a solution to a practical problem. They could not have known what they were beginning. The mutations themselves are the foundational fact of what a Witcher is, and they deserve careful description, because without understanding them, you cannot understand Geralt. A Witcher's capabilities do not come from years of training alone, though the training is extraordinary and begins in childhood. They come from a process of biological transformation so radical that it occupies the boundary between medicine and alchemy, between enhancement and violence committed upon the body in the hope that the body survives it. There are 2 stages to Witcher mutation, though the first is so severe that not every candidate survives it. Boys are brought to Kaer Morhen young, old enough to begin understanding what is being asked of them, but young enough that their bodies retain the flexibility necessary to survive the process. The trial of the grasses, which is the name given to the first stage of mutation, involves the introduction of a complex sequence of alchemical compounds into the body. These compounds, whose precise formulas were developed over generations of painful experimentation and are now among the most closely guarded secrets in the world, begin a systematic transformation of the candidate's physiology. The liver changes first, developing the capacity to process substances that would be fatal to an unmodified human, to metabolize the Witcher potions that the profession requires without the poisoning that those same potions would inflict on anyone else. Then the nervous system, rebuilt to process sensory information with a precision and speed that no natural human nervous system achieves. Reaction times drop to fractions of what any trained soldier can manage. The ability to read and predict movement becomes almost prescient, not because of magic, but because the altered nervous system is simply operating at a different level of efficiency than the baseline human body ever reaches. The eyes change. This is the change that marks a Witcher most visibly to anyone who encounters one. The pupils become vertical, like a cat's, capable of dilating to extraordinary widths in darkness and contracting to fine slits in bright light. A Witcher can see in near complete darkness, with the clarity that a normal person experiences only at noon. This alone would be transformative. Combined with the other sensory enhancements, the amplified hearing, the ability to detect trace scents with a reliability approaching a hunting dog's, it produces a creature of genuinely different perceptual experience from any ordinary human. The body changes in ways that are less visible but equally profound. Bone density increases, muscle tissue becomes denser and more efficient, producing strength that is not dramatic to observe, but is consistent and extraordinary in application. The circulatory system is modified to support rapid healing, so that injuries that would incapacitate or kill an unmodified person can be recovered from in hours or days rather than weeks. Witchers feel pain. This is important and often misunderstood. They feel it completely. They simply do not stop because of it the way that pain compels ordinary people to stop. There is something else the mutations do that is more subtle and more contested in its meaning. They alter emotional processing in ways that reduce the intensity of certain feelings. Fear becomes manageable not because the Witcher is incapable of recognizing danger, but because the physiological cascade that turns recognized danger into paralyzing terror is interrupted. Certain forms of attachment, the kind that make rational decision-making difficult in high-stakes situations, are dampened. Witches are described by the people who meet them as cold, as inhuman, as difficult to read. Some of this is true. Some of it is projection from people who find it unsettling to meet someone who does not frighten in the way they expect. But here is what is also true, and what the story of Geralt demonstrates more clearly than any theoretical argument could. The mutations alter, but they do not erase. A witcher who claims to have no feelings is, in every case the chronicles record, describing an aspiration rather than an achievement. The feelings are there, quieter, differently organized, less likely to flood the decision-making faculties at inconvenient moments. But they are there. Geralt himself, over the long arc of his life, becomes proof of this in ways that he resists acknowledging, and that the people who know him best recognize long before he does himself. The training at Kaer Morhen runs alongside the mutations and continues long after the biological transformation is complete. The swordsmanship curriculum taught to witches is among the most comprehensive fighting systems ever developed anywhere on the continent, drawing from human and elven traditions and supplementing them with techniques developed specifically for fighting creatures that do not fight the way humans do. Monsters are not limited by human assumptions about balance, reach, or the direction from which an attack can come. Witcher sword technique is built on this understanding. 2 swords are the Witcher's signature, one made of steel for human opponents and the mundane animals that sometimes pose threats, one made of silver for creatures vulnerable to silver, which includes most of the monsters the continent's wilderness produced. This silver sword is not merely symbolic, though it carries symbolic weight in the way that tools carried for long enough tend to accumulate meaning beyond their function. It is a practical response to a practical reality. Some things simply die more readily to silver, and a witcher who cannot kill them efficiently is not a witcher who remains employed or alive for very long. By the time a boy who has survived the trial of the grasses completes his training and takes his silver sword and rides away from Kaer Morhen for the first time, he is not entirely the person he was when he arrived. He is something the world produced a need for and then struggled to accommodate, something necessary and feared in roughly equal measure. He is a professional whose profession requires him to spend his life in the places ordinary people are afraid to go, killing the things ordinary people are afraid to name, for fees that ordinary people sometimes refuse to pay once the immediate danger is past. He'll spend the rest of his life on the roads of the continent, moving from contract to contract, sleeping in cheap inns when he can afford them, and in the open when he cannot, eating the meals that are available rather than the meals he might prefer, aging far more slowly than any human being has a right to age, but aging nonetheless, carrying the weight of all he has seen without quite the same vocabulary for processing it that someone raised in a village or a city would have developed for processing their own considerably smaller weight, and he will be lonely. This is perhaps the thing about witches that requires the most careful and honest saying. The mutations and the training and the life on the road all conspire to produce a form of isolation that is not always chosen and not always regretted, but is very nearly absolute. The villages witches protect are glad of the protection and uneasy about the protector. The children who approach with wide eyes and questions are called back by parents who fear the influence of someone so obviously other. The in-common rooms go slightly quieter when a witcher walks in, then return gradually to their previous volume, talking around the witcher rather than to him the way water flows around a stone. Into this institution, into this life, into this tradition of necessary loneliness and genuine expertise, a boy arrived at Kaer Morhen. He was very young. He was given, as all the boys were given, a set of tests and a set of compounds, and a set of choices made by adults who believed they were doing something necessary. He went through the trial of the grasses. He survived it. And then something extraordinary happened. Something that had never happened before. Something that would eventually become the defining fact of his existence. Let your breath slow as we approach it. The next part deserves its own darkness. The winters at Kaer Morhen had their own discipline, separate from and supplementary to the formal training curriculum. The months of isolation, when the snow closed the mountain pass and the fortress was sealed against the outside world, created conditions of enforced proximity that produced either fracture or cohesion, and in the best years produced both in sequence. The witches who wintered at Kaer Morhen between seasons of contract work were not all the same age or the same temperament or the same level of experience, and the dynamic that emerged between senior and junior witches, between the veterans who'd been riding the roads for decades and the young ones newly returned from their first seasons, had the complicated texture of any community organized around shared expertise and significant inequality of experience. The armory at Kaer Morhen contained weapons that had accumulated over the generations of the school's operation, a mixed collection of practical tools and historical artifacts that the witches used and maintained with the unsentimental efficiency of professionals who understood that a sword's value was in its edge rather than its provenance. But there were pieces in that collection that even the most practical witches treated with a quality that fell just short of reverence. Weapons that had been carried by specific witches in specific legendary encounters, and that had acquired through that association a weight beyond their material constitution. These objects were the closest thing Kaer Morhen had to monuments, its way of honouring its own history in a world that was not generally disposed to honour it. The youngest trainees who arrived at Kaer Morhen came from varied circumstances. Some had been sent by families who recognised the magical sensitivity or the unusual physical aptitude of a child, and understood, or had been told, that the Witcher School represented a viable future for someone who might otherwise struggle to find a place in the ordinary arrangements of the world. Others came from circumstances considerably harder, orphaned or abandoned, gathered by the Witcher recruiters who moved through the continent's poorer regions, identifying suitable candidates with the particular combination of traits the trial of the grasses required. All of them, regardless of origin, underwent the same process once they arrived, a levelling that was simultaneously just and brutal, stripping the identities they had arrived with down to the raw material of what they could become. Settle deeper now, let your shoulders release. Notice whether there is any place in your body holding tension that it does not need to hold, and let that tension soften, not all at once, but the way a fist opens when sleep begins to arrive, finger by finger, unheld, unclenched. The story we're entering now is a story of transformation, of what the body can endure and what survives on the other side. It is not a comfortable story, but it is one that asks important questions about what it means to become something new. Breathe in, breathe out, we continue. Most of what happens in the trial of the grasses is not witnessed by anyone outside the room in which it occurs. The masters who administer it do not describe it freely, and the boys who survive it rarely speak about it with clarity, partly because the experience is difficult to articulate, and partly because there is a quality of it, a fever-bright intensity, that makes the memories unreliable in the way that all extreme experiences make their own memories unreliable. What is known from fragments, from the testimony of the few who have spoken about it, from the dedications in old Witcher journals where the experience is referenced but not fully described. The compounds are introduced over a period of days, not all at once. The body's given time between each introduction not as mercy, but as method, because overloading the system too quickly produces outcomes that end the process prematurely and permanently. The candidate lies in a prepared chamber in the lower levels of Kaer Morhen, where the stone is cold enough to be felt even through a straw mattress, and the masters monitor the body's response with the careful attention of people performing an experiment they know may not work. The fever comes first. It comes as a high, cresting thing that produces hallucinations whose content varies by individual but tends to share certain characteristics: darkness, immense pressure, the sensation of being unmade at the cellular level and reassembled in a different configuration. Witchers who have spoken about this stage describe it as dying, and discovering that dying is not the end but a transition, a passage through something very narrow into something wider on the other side. This may be metaphor, it may be something else. The distinction matters less than the experience itself. The bones ache next, a deep ache that is not like the ache of injury, but like the ache of growth, which is what it is, the skeleton responding to the compounds by attempting to rebuild itself, denser and more capable than it was before. This process takes longer than the fever, and is in some ways more grueling because the candidate is conscious through much of it. Not fully conscious, but enough to feel it, hovering in that grey zone between awareness and oblivion, where the body's signals arrive without the distance that full unconsciousness would provide. The eyes change last, or nearly last. The candidates who reach this stage have already survived the worst of it in terms of biological shock, but the eye transformation is the one that tends to produce the most visible distress in those who observe it from the outside. The irises change colour, most commonly settling in the yellow or amber range, and the pupils shift from round to the vertical slit that will mark the Witcher for the rest of his life. There are accounts of masters who had administered the trial for decades, and still found themselves looking away at the moment of the eye change, not from weakness, but from something that the body insists upon, some deep recognition that what is happening here is a crossing of a threshold that the biological world does not usually permit. Not everyone survives. This is stated plainly in every account of the trial, and it is stated plainly here because sanitizing it would misrepresent what the Witcher institution actually was, and what it actually asked. The mortality rate among candidates, the boys who entered the trial and did not emerge from it, is estimated variously in the historical sources, but most accounts place it somewhere between 30 and 50%. Some of the deaths were quick, some were not. All of them were understood by the masters as acceptable losses in pursuit of a necessary outcome. Understand that sentence. Acceptable losses. The masters who administered the trial were not indifferent to the deaths. Most accounts suggest they were not cruel people. They were people who had concluded, through the particular logic of their time and their necessity, that the production of capable monster hunters was worth the cost of the failures along the way. This is the kind of reasoning that history tends to judge harshly in retrospect, and that participants tend to accept as inevitable at the time. It was a different era in a world with different threats. The judgment we pass on it from the comfort of this dark room, from the safety of this late hour, is perhaps not the most useful engagement with it. What matters more for this story is what happened when a particular boy, the boy who would become Geralt, survived the trial in a way that had no precedent and generated a reaction in his administrators that fell somewhere between awe and alarm. He survived it completely, fully, with a totality that the compounds had never before produced in any candidate. Sit with this for a moment. Let the weight of it settle. When the trial of the grasses ended and the boy who had entered it emerged on the other side, he was not merely a successful Witcher candidate. He was something the formula had never produced before, something that suggested the compounds had interacted with his particular biology in a way that multiplied rather than simply transmitted their effects. He was faster than any Witcher the Masters had produced. His senses were more acute. His healing was faster. His resistance to the later trials, the secondary mutations that most Witchers approach as additional risks to be survived, seemed to operate almost as non-events for him, as though the first transformation had already pushed him so far past the ordinary human baseline that the subsequent ones had little additional work to do. The Masters debated what to do with this information. Some wanted to understand it, to study it, to see whether whatever had made this candidate's response unique could be replicated in others. Some were troubled by it, by the idea of a Witcher who was more than a Witcher, by the implications for an institution that had always maintained a careful balance between capability and the appearance of controllability. Witchers were useful to the kingdoms of the continent precisely because they were powerful enough to handle things that ordinary soldiers could not, and human enough to be understood as tools rather than threats. A Witcher who exceeded that formula in significant ways upset the balance. The boy's hair turned white. This is one of the most recognizable physical facts about Geralt of Rivia, and it came from the trial of the grasses. Most Witchers retained some approximation of their original hair colour after the mutations, or the colour shifts in subtle ways that are unremarkable. Geralt's hair went completely, entirely white, as though the experience had drained the pigment from every strand simultaneously. It was not a gradual process. It happened as part of the transformation, and when he emerged from the chamber, the white hair was already there, complete and permanent. He would carry it for the rest of his life, the most visible marker of what had happened to him and how thoroughly it had happened. People on the road would see it and know immediately before he spoke or moved or reached for a sword that they were looking at a Witcher. And among Witchers, other Witchers, those who knew the law and understood what the white hair signified, they would know something more. They were looking at someone for whom the trial had worked better than designed, someone who sat at the outer edge of what the formula could produce. They gave him a name during his training, the kind of name that arises from a detail repeated often enough in a community small enough to use informal designations. The White Wolf, some called him, or simply the White One, and the name was literal before it was mythological, a simple description of the most visible thing about him. Later, when his reputation grew and the stories about him began to accumulate the additional weight that stories accumulate when passed from person to person across enough geography and enough time, the name would carry connotations of something wilder and more uncanny than simply unusual hair. But at Kaer Morhen, among the masters and the other trainees, it was just a name for the boy who had survived the trial in a way that no one had quite seen before. He was given his education in swordsmanship and alchemy, and the natural history of the creatures he would spend his life fighting. He showed aptitude across all of it, the aptitude of someone whose altered cognition had produced not just faster reflexes, but a genuinely different quality of attention, an ability to absorb and integrate complex information about monster behavior and vulnerability that the Masters found unusual, even in the context of unusual candidates. He was not performing for their approval, which made the aptitude more credible. He was simply interested in the way that people who find their native element are interested, with a focus that doesn't require effort because it's the direction the mind naturally moves. He eventually took on the surname Rivia, which was common practice for witches who wanted to present a degree of normalcy to the human communities they moved through. Having an origin, even a false one, made you less threatening than having no origin at all. He was not from Rivia. He had never been from Rivia. But the name served its purpose, and in the way of false names adopted for practical reasons and then carried long enough, it eventually became as real as any other kind of truth. When he rode away from Kaer Morhen for the first time, the mountains behind him and the continent before him, he was something the world had been building toward without knowing it, something the conjunction of the spheres had set in motion 15 centuries before his birth, something the accumulated necessities of human expansion and monster proliferation and magical development had conspired to require and then finally to produce. He was the Witcher. He was the White Wolf. He was Geralt of Rivia, going out to meet a world that would never quite know what to do with him. Let yourself rest in this moment of departure. The road ahead is long, and night is very quiet. The secondary mutations which Geralt underwent in the aftermath of surviving the Trial of the Grasses with such unusual thoroughness pushed what was already exceptional further into territory the Masters had no precedent for mapping. Most witches received the secondary mutations as additional refinements to a process that the trial had already completed in its essential form. For Geralt, the relationship was different. The secondary mutations operating on a system that had already been so thoroughly transformed that their effects compounded in ways the standard models of witcher physiology did not predict, and the Masters found themselves extrapolating into unfamiliar territory to understand. His signs, when he developed them in training, were stronger than the standard Witcher baseline by a margin the combat instructors at first attributed to his exceptional physical condition, and later acknowledged was something different. A depth of connection to the ambient chaos of the world that suggested the mutations had opened channels in him that typically remained more constricted. This did not make him a mage. The distinction is important. What a witcher can do with magical force and what a trained sorcerer can do with it are separated by years of formal education and by the specific neural and physiological development that full magical training produces. Geralt could do witcher things very well. He could not do what Yennefer could do, and he knew this and did not confuse the two categories. The white hair became, over the course of his early years on the road, a practical liability as much as a distinguishing mark. In situations where a witcher might benefit from passing unnoticed through a community before the nature of the contract was established, Geralt could not pass unnoticed. He was identifiable from a considerable distance by anyone who'd ever seen a witcher before, and in regions with established witcher traffic most adults had. He adapted to this by developing the approach of presenting himself directly rather than obliquely, which had the secondary benefit of establishing his identity on his own terms, rather than allowing it to be established by the assumptions of the people he encountered. This directness became one of his most recognizable characteristics, a quality that some people read as arrogance and others read as respect, the respect of not pretending to be something other than what you are. You're still here and the night is still here with you, and both of those things are good. Let your breathing settle into whatever rhythm it has found on its own, because your body already knows how to breathe for sleep. It has been doing it your entire life, and tonight it is doing it for you while you listen. The story is moving now, out of the mountains onto the roads of the continent, into the long middle years of Geralt's life before the events that would change it fundamentally. These are the years that built him, quietly, the way water builds a river's course, not through drama but through repetition. The road between one Witcher contract and the next is not romantic in the way that stories about travelling swordsmen tend to make it. It is long. It is often wet. The inns charge more when they see a Witcher coming and serve worse food, understanding that the Witcher will pay, rather than sleep outside in the rain, and having accurately assessed the Witcher's leverage in the negotiation. The roads of the northern kingdoms are maintained with varying degrees of commitment by the nobility responsible for them, which means they are excellent near capitals and towns of consequence, and increasingly unreliable as they extend into the territory between settlements where the monster populations are also, not coincidentally, highest. Geralt moved through this landscape for years, for decades, accumulating the kind of knowledge that can only be accumulated through direct encounter. He learned which regions had higher concentrations of which types of creatures, and why, because the ecology of monsters is not random, but follows patterns that a sufficiently observant person can identify and use. He learned which villages were likely to have honest dealings with a Witcher, and which were likely to negotiate the fee down after the work was done, or to deny that the problem had ever been serious enough to warrant the agreed payment once the immediate terror had passed. He developed, over these years, the particular emotional economy of someone who has learned not to expect gratitude and has organized their interior life accordingly. This is not bitterness. Bitterness requires ongoing disappointment, and Geralt was not often disappointed because he had adjusted his expectations to match the reality he encountered rather than the one he might have preferred. People feared what they did not understand, and they did not understand witches, not really, not in the way that would have allowed them to extend the ordinary social warmth that they extended to members of their own communities. Geralt was useful, and therefore tolerated, and toleration was what he had and what he worked with. The contracts themselves were varied enough to resist easy summary. Monsters are not a category that admits of uniformity. A drowner infestation at a river crossing requires completely different preparation and completely different technique from a strigger haunting a castle, which in turn shares almost nothing with a basilisk terrorizing a mining settlement, which is entirely unlike the work involved in clearing a Necker warren from beneath a farming village's foundations. Geralt was not a man who did the same thing repeatedly. He was a man who did different things that all required the same deep capability, the same prepared body and prepared mind and prepared kit of signs and swords and knowledge. The signs deserve mention here, because they are often misunderstood by people who encounter witches primarily through their swordsmanship. Witches are not mages. They do not wield the chaos that flows through the world with the sophistication or the power of trained sorcerers. But the mutations that make a witcher capable of unusual physical performance also open, to a limited degree, the sensitivity to chaos that proper magical training can develop further. Witches channel this limited sensitivity into a small set of simple but potent spells they call signs, each one a focused application of magical force shaped for specific purposes. Ard pushes, a telekinetic force useful for knocking opponents off their feet or breaking objects. Yrden is a trap, a magical snare that slows or immobilizes creatures that enter its circle. Igni is fire, directed and controllable, useful against creatures vulnerable to heat, and for the more mundane purpose of starting fires in wet conditions when an ordinary flint would struggle. Quen is a shield, a bubble of defensive force that absorbs a certain amount of incoming damage before shattering. And Axii, the most subtle and in some ways the most troubling of the signs, is influence over the mind. the ability to calm or confuse a creature or a person, to plant a suggestion, or temporarily override will. Geralt used Axii sparingly and thoughtfully, in the way that someone who has power over others tends to treat it when they are genuinely careful about ethics. The sign could make difficult encounters easier, it could prevent unnecessary violence, it could also be used to manipulate people in ways that would have horrified them if they had known it was happening, and Geralt was aware of this and allowed the awareness to constrain him. He had opinions about the right uses of power that were more consistent than the people who encountered him briefly might have suspected, organised around a set of values that were not simple but were genuine. The monster hunter's life had a rhythm to it that could, if you were inclined to find rhythm in difficult things, be described as meditative, the preparation before a contract, the research, the alchemy, the brewing of the potions that enhance witcher capabilities for the duration of a specific encounter, the execution of the contract itself, which was often very fast, a few seconds or a few minutes, the concentrated expression of all the preparation that preceded it, and then the aftermath, the long quiet roads leading away from the resolved problem toward the next unresolved one, hours of riding in weather that did not concern itself with the rider's preferences. During these years of travel, Geralt developed something that the people who knew him best would later identify as his primary philosophical orientation, his belief in lesser evil. This is a principle that sounds simple and is not. It begins with the observation that in many situations that require a choice, all available options are bad, that the moral universe does not always offer a good option alongside the bad ones, that sometimes the choice is only between bad and worse. A person who accepts this observation has to decide what to do with it. Geralt's decision was to engage anyway, to try to identify which option was least harmful and to pursue it, while holding with genuine honesty the awareness that least harmful is not the same as good. This made him appear, to people who interacted with him briefly or misunderstood what he was doing, as though he was trying to remain neutral, as though the white wolf was someone who refused to take sides. The opposite was true. He was someone who took sides so carefully and so thoughtfully that the taking of them sometimes looked like abstention to people who expected commitment to look louder. He was not indifferent. He was precise. And the precision, in a world that rewarded passionate declaration over careful action, made him difficult to read and easy to mischaracterize. The law of surprise is among the oldest compact traditions of the continent, older than most of the kingdoms, older even than many of the customs that those kingdoms claim as foundational. It works like this. When one person saves another's life, the saved person may repay the debt by offering the saver the first thing that meets them when they return home, that they did not expect to find there. The law of surprise is a wager on fate, an acknowledgement that destiny has an interest in the transactions of the living, that the universe has opinions about what constitutes fair exchange. In most invocations of the law, the thing the saved person returns home to find unexpectedly is an animal, a neighbour's wandering goat, a stray dog, perhaps a promising foal born while the owner was away. Occasionally the unexpected thing is a valuable object, a relative's gift arriving from a distant city, a shipment of goods that came early. The law is typically a good-natured gesture, a traditional formality between people who want to acknowledge a debt without establishing the specific terms of its repayment. Geralt invoked it once, in circumstances that were not entirely clear in his own telling of them afterward, at a banquet in the kingdom of Cintra where a debt of a complicated kind was being negotiated. He saved a man's life, or prevented a death. The accounts are inconsistent on the precise nature of the crisis. And when the man offered to repay the debt, Geralt, in a moment that had something impulsive about it that was unusual for someone so habitually careful, invoked the law of surprise. The man agreed, and the law was invoked. And when the man returned to his home, to the court of Cintra, to the seat of a queen named Calanthe, who ruled one of the most proudly independent kingdoms in the north, he found waiting for him something he had not expected to find and had not even known existed. His daughter had returned from a journey, and his daughter was pregnant, and so the law of surprise delivered to Geralt of Rivia, the white wolf who had ridden the roads of the continent for decades in deliberate solitude, a child who had not yet been born. He did not go to collect her. He was not ready to, or not willing to, or both. And for Geralt, those two states were often difficult to distinguish from each other. He rode away from Cintra with the knowledge of what the law had bound him to, and a disinclination to act on it, that he told himself was practical, but that had the texture of fear underneath its practical justifications. He had organized his life specifically around not having things to lose. The law of surprise had given him something to lose before he had agreed to want it. But destiny, this world's version of it, the deep structural force that Geralt both believed in and resented believing in, has a way of making the things you try to avoid approach you from a direction you didn't account for. He would go back to Cintra, not yet, but eventually, and when he did, the world that had been building toward him since the conjunction of the spheres would deliver its next piece, the piece that completed the picture in a way he could not have anticipated and could not, when it arrived, refuse. Let the roads go quiet now. Let the horse find its own pace. The kingdom is still a long ride ahead, and the night around you is very deep. The economics of the Witcher profession are worth understanding in some detail, because they shaped Geralt's existence in ways that are easy to romanticize past and difficult to actually inhabit. A Witcher charges for contracts based on the nature of the threat, the danger involved, the difficulty of preparation, and the time required, which sounds like a straightforward professional arrangement, but operates in a market where the person setting the price is in a structurally disadvantaged negotiating position. The people who need a Witcher need one because they have a problem they cannot solve through any other available means, which creates demand. But they also tend to resent the dependence that the demand creates, which reduces their willingness to pay the full value of what they are receiving. This dynamic produced, over Geralt's years on the road, a specific relationship with money that was neither comfortable nor bitter but simply practical. He did not accumulate wealth in the way that professionals of equivalent skill in other fields might have expected to. He operated near a subsistence level for much of his career, with periods of relative comfort following particularly well-compensated contracts, and periods of genuine hardship when the contract was scarce, or the negotiations had gone badly. He managed this with the equanimity of someone who had never expected comfort, and was therefore not particularly diminished by its absence, which is a form of resilience that costs more than it appears to. The roads between contracts also gave Geralt an education in the actual texture of life on the continent, at the level below the level at which official histories operate. He did not see the continent through the eyes of its kings or its mages or its wealthy merchants. He saw it through the eyes of the people those kings and mages and merchants governed, the farmers and innkeepers and craftspeople and labourers who constituted the actual substance of the civilization that the official accounts described in terms of its political and military events. He knew what a village looked like when the harvest had been bad for 2 years in succession. He knew what an in-common room sounded like at midnight in a town that had recently received bad news, This knowledge lived in him differently from the knowledge he'd received at Kaer Morhen, less formal and more complete, the knowledge of someone who has inhabited a world rather than studied it. Come back to your breath. Let it fill you fully, that slow inhale that asks nothing of you except to receive it, and then the exhale that carries something away, whatever it is you no longer need tonight. You are safe in this darkness. The story is moving towards something important now, something that will require your full attention even as your body grows heavier, even as the boundary between listening and dreaming becomes less clear. This is exactly how it should be. Let the words carry you. We're going to Cintra. Cintra is a coastal kingdom in the south of the Northern Territories, sitting at the mouth of the Aruga River, where it empties into the Great Sea, its harbour busy with the traffic of merchants who prefer its neutrality to the political entanglements of the larger kingdoms to the north. It is prosperous in the way that well-positioned trading cities tend to be prosperous, not spectacularly wealthy, but reliably so, its merchant class substantial, and its nobility comfortable, and its ruling queen one of the most formidable individuals in the political landscape of the north. Queen Calanthe of Cintra, known across the continent as the Lioness of Cintra, is one of those historical figures who generate such strong impressions in everyone who encounters her, that the accounts of those encounters tend to say as much about the person encountering as about Calanthe herself. She was proud, in the particular way of someone who had earned her pride through competence rather than merely through birth, having led Cintran forces in battle personally and won, having governed her kingdom through decades of external pressure with a steadiness that the more powerful kingdoms surrounding her had found simultaneously admirable and inconvenient. She was not, to put it plainly, the kind of person who accepted that things were out of her hands. Her daughter's name was Pavetta, and Pavetta's story is a complicated one that intersects with the law of surprise and with the question of destiny in ways that Geralt would spend years trying to think around, and eventually stop trying to think around, because thinking around destiny in this world is approximately as productive as arguing with weather. Pavetta had a gift, a wild and untrained magical ability that manifested in ways she could not control, a talent so significant and so unruly that it had shaped the entire arc of her young life in ways she herself did not always understand. The man Geralt had saved, the man whose gratitude had invoked the law of surprise, was a knight named Duny, and Duny was the man Pavetta loved, and Duny had a curse of his own, a transformation that made him something monstrous to look at, and the entire tangle of magical obligation and romantic love and maternal resistance and political manoeuvring had come to a head at a royal banquet in Cintra, where Geralt happened to be present. Geralt intervened in a crisis that was spinning toward catastrophe, using his skills and his signs to help resolve it, and in the aftermath, in the gratitude of the saved, he had spoken the words that bound fate to him. He claimed his law of surprise. Duny returned home, and the unexpected thing waiting for him was what Pavetta had not yet revealed. She was carrying his child, a daughter, a girl who would be born within the year, a girl who was, from the moment of her conception, bound to the law of surprise, and therefore, by the deep logic of this world's understanding of fate, bound to Geralt. The child was called Ciri, Cirilla Fiona Ellen Rhiannon, the lion cub of Cintra, the granddaughter of the lioness. Pause here, just for a moment. Breathe slowly, and let this arrangement settle into full focus. A girl not yet born is already bound to a witcher by an ancient law. A witcher who did not particularly want to be bound to anyone has spoken the words that bound him. Destiny in the world of The Witcher is not a comfortable metaphor. It is described by the most learned people in the world as an actual force, a tendency in events to arrange themselves around certain outcomes, despite the efforts of individuals to arrange them otherwise. The scholars call these outcomes destiny's arrangements. Geralt called them, with his characteristic economy of expression, inconveniences. He left Cintra without collecting the child. He rode away from the debt of the law as though sufficient distance might dissolve it, as though the width of the continent between him and the girl might make the obligation abstract enough to ignore. This was not cowardice, though it can look like it from outside. It was the response of a man who had constructed his entire existence around not being responsible for anything beyond the completion of a specific contract. A man for whom the idea of a permanent charge, a child, a dependent, a person whose well-being he would have to care about in a sustained and ongoing way, constituted a fundamental challenge to everything he had built to survive his solitary life. But Ciri grew. In Cintra, under Calanthe's fierce and sometimes suffocating protection, the girl who was the Law of Surprise's gift to the White Wolf became a person. She had her grandmother's pride and her mother's wildness, and something else beneath both of those things, something that the women of Calanthe's blood carried in ways they did not always know and did not always understand. She was quick and stubborn, and smarter than she was often given credit for, which made her a more interesting child than the court usually knew what to do with. The elder blood is what the elven scholars called it. Lara Doran ep Shiardel was its origin, an elven woman of extraordinary magical sensitivity who lived in the early centuries after the Conjunction, during the first great expansion of human civilization, during the wars and displacement and complicated love stories that attended that expansion. Lara Doran made a choice that was rare for her people and deeply consequential for the genetic line she founded, and through a succession of daughters stretching across centuries, the specific magical inheritance she carried was passed down and compressed, diluted by some generations and concentrated by others, until it arrived in Ciri in a form more potent than it had been in any of the generations between Lara Doran and the lion cub of Cintra. What the Elder Blood does, in practice, is give its carrier an extraordinary and unstable relationship with time and space. Ciri could, under sufficient stress or with sufficient practice, open passages between places, step sideways out of the world as it was, and into something else, something adjacent. Later she would develop this ability into something more refined and more controlled. But in childhood it was an unruly gift that manifested mostly as a feeling of wrongness, a sense that she did not quite belong to the moment she was standing in, that other moments were available to her if she reached sideways in a direction she could not have pointed to but could always feel. She knew nothing about Geralt for most of her childhood. Calanthe made sure of that, because Calanthe's feelings about the Law of Surprise were complex and her feelings about releasing her granddaughter to a witcher were simple. She was not going to do it. She was Calanthe of Cintra, the lioness, a queen who had outlasted every attempt to constrain or diminish her authority. She was not going to surrender the person she loved most to an obligation from an old law invoked at a banquet by a man who had not even bothered to come and collect on it. This was, in its way, understandable. It was also in the way of understandable positions that deny the deep structure of reality, not ultimately sustainable. Destiny tends to assert itself in this world, not through dramatic revelations, but through the slow accumulation of converging circumstances, each one individually manageable, the combination eventually impossible to root around. Calanthe spent years rooting around it. She arranged for other men to court Ciri, other possible futures to take shape around the girl, other obligations to supersede the ancient law, and then Nilfgaard arrived. The fall of Cintra is one of the defining events of the era. The Nilfgaardian Empire, which had been pressing its borders northward for generations in the patient manner of empires that think in centuries, moved its armies across the Yaruga River in force. The battle was fierce and brutal, and ultimately one-sided in the way that wars between a determined empire and a small proud kingdom tend to be one-sided. Calanthe fought. She fought as the lioness she was, personally and with full commitment to a resistance that the tactical situation did not support. Cintra fell. Calanthe, wounded and refusing capture, made the choice that the lioness of Cintra made when the cage closed around her. Ciri was not in the city when it fell. She had been sent away into the chaos of refugees and burning roads, with the instruction to find the White Wolf, with the instruction to find Geralt of Rivia, the Witcher who had claimed her before her birth, the man to whom the law of surprise had bound her, and from whom she'd been kept by a queen who had now spent her last act releasing what she had kept. The girl who had never met the man she was looking for made her way through a ruined country toward a Witcher she knew only by name, and by the story of the law of surprise, and by her grandmother's complicated feelings about both. And Geralt, somewhere on the roads of the continent, felt something shift, not in the way that magic shifts, not with a sound or a visible sign, but in the way that fate announces itself to those who are, despite their protestations to the contrary, already listening for it. He would find her, or she would find him, which amounts to the same thing when destiny is the one arranging the geography. Let that thought settle into you now like warm water finding level. The child is moving toward the Witcher, and the Witcher is moving toward the child, and the night around both of them is full of the sound of a world rearranging itself around an inevitability it has been preparing since before either of them were born. Rest in this, the finding is very close. The city of Cintra in its final days had the specific atmosphere of a place that knows something is coming and has chosen to meet it with defiance rather than accommodation. Calanthe's court maintained its routines, its feasts and its audiences and its management of the city's affairs, but there was underneath all of this the quality of theatre performed by people who are aware they are performing, who are choosing performance over paralysis because performance, at least, is something they know how to do. The lioness herself carried this quality most visibly. Her public presence during those last months so deliberately undiminished in its authority and its ease that anyone watching closely could recognize the will required to maintain it. The roads south of Cintra in the weeks following the city's fall were among the most dangerous roads on the continent during that period. The Nilfgaardian advance had disrupted every established order of the region, the soldiers and bandits and desperate refugees all moving through the same geography in ways that made the ordinary calculations of safe travel impossible. Ciri moved through this chaos with the help of people she encountered, whose reasons for helping her varied from genuine altruism to pragmatic calculation, and in the process she received a compressed and brutal education in how the world actually operated beneath the official arrangement she had grown up inside the protection of. The connection between Geralt and Ciri before they met, before either of them had stood in the same physical space as the other, existed already in the form of the law of surprise and the way that the deep logic of this world's destiny operated on those who were bound by it. When Geralt felt the shift, the change in the quality of the world that he had long since learned to interpret as destiny asserting its arrangements, it was not a dramatic vision or a clear message but a feeling in the chest, a sense of direction without specific coordinates, the kind of knowing that the body produces before the mind has caught up with what the body already understands. He turned toward it, as he had been turning toward it since the banquet at Cintra, without ever fully acknowledging that the turning was happening. The elven scholars who had tracked the line of the elder blood across its generations of dilution and concentration described it using a metaphor that translated roughly as a river finding its level, the suggestion being that this particular inheritance had a tendency to express itself most fully, not in the generation immediately following its most recent dilution, but several generations further along, after the waters had clarified. Ciri represented in this framework the generation of clarification, the point in the line where the elder blood was present in a purity not seen since Lara Dorren herself, concentrated by the particular genetic lottery of the intervening centuries into an expression that exceeded what the line had produced in the immediately preceding generations. Queen Clanthe's feelings about Ciri were the organising principle of the last decade of her reign, visible in every political decision she made about Cintra's external relationships and every domestic decision she made about the court's structure and the girl's upbringing. She was doing two things simultaneously that were in fundamental tension with each other. She was raising Ciri to be capable of surviving whatever came, which required honesty about the world's dangers, and she was protecting Ciri from the specific danger of the law of surprises implications, which required a controlled withholding of certain truths. The tension between these two projects produced in Calanthe a particular form of anguish that was invisible in her public presentation and visible only in the private accounts of the people closest to her. Let the darkness be generous with you right now. Let it hold you the way deep water holds everything, without effort, without judgment, supporting your weight completely. You've been travelling a long way tonight, through old history and older magic, through a world that is vast and strange and surprisingly human at its centre. We pause here, before continuing toward the part of the story that requires both Ciri and Geralt to be fully understood, to meet the third person at the centre of everything. Her story begins badly, as the most important stories often do, and ends, if endings are possible for someone like her, somewhere much more complicated. Yennefer of Vengerberg was born in the village of Vengerberg in Aedern, the fourth child of a merchant who was not particularly prosperous, and a mother who had no magical talent at all, and therefore no framework for understanding the daughter who did. The talent manifested early, as magical talent in this world tends to do, and its manifestation was not the gentle, impressive kind that parents feel proud of. It was wild and frightening, and expressed itself primarily as accidents, things breaking, things starting fires, things that were solid becoming briefly not solid, in the way that raw magical ability expresses itself before it has been shaped by training into something directed and useful. She also had a curvature of the spine. This is mentioned not as the most important fact about Yennefer, because it is not the most important fact, but because it was formative in ways that everything else in her history builds upon. It caused her pain, and it shaped her posture, and it shaped the way the world responded to her, and the way the world responded to her shaped, in turn, the person she decided she would become. She experienced from a young age the particular education in cruelty and dismissal that the world extends to people whose bodies do not conform to what the world considers presentable, and she learned from that education the lesson that too many people learn from it, that she would have to be remarkable to be treated as ordinary. She was sent to the academy at Aretuza, the school for young sorceresses on the island of Thaned, because her talent was impossible to ignore, and because Aretuza's recruiters, who scoured the continent for magical ability, were not in the business of leaving talent untrained in the provinces where it would eventually cause accidents too large to explain away. At Aretusa, she encountered for the first time the formal structure of magical education, the disciplines and the theory and the practice, and she was good at it, genuinely and measurably good, in ways that her teachers noticed and that her fellow students found variously inspiring and irritating. She was also, at Aretusa, given her first understanding of what membership in the Brotherhood of Sorcerers actually meant and what it cost. Sorcerers and sorceresses in this world are sterile as a consequence of their training. The transformations involved in developing full magical capability render them unable to have biological children. This is not presented to the students as a tragedy or a sacrifice, but as a professional fact, something that comes with the territory of the life they are choosing. Many accept it. Some find alternative forms of family. A smaller number spend the rest of their lives in complex relationship with the loss, neither fully accepting nor fully rejecting its implications. Yennefer went further than all of that. She agreed willingly to a full physical transformation that was part of her preparation for life as a sorceress of consequence, a transformation that addressed not just the cosmetic but the deep structural differences between the body she'd been born with and the body she had decided she would occupy. The process was performed by a mage named Tisaya de Vries, who was Aretusa's rector, and who had recruited Yennefer personally, and who understood, perhaps better than anyone else in the academy, what the girl was capable of and what it would cost to unlock that capability fully. The transformation was successful. Yennefer emerged from it the way a knife emerges from the whetstone, refined and sharp and slightly colder for the process. She was strikingly beautiful in the aftermath, in the precise way that things shaped by very careful hands tend to be beautiful, and she was aware of this and used the awareness as a tool the way she'd learned to use everything available to her, not out of vanity, but out of the same strategic intelligence that had kept her functional in environments that had no interest in her comfort. Beauty, in a world where sorceresses were both valued and distrusted, was leverage. She understood leverage. What she did not understand, or did not want to understand, was that the transformation had not resolved the question at its centre. She had changed her body. She had not changed the wound underneath it, the old hurt of being the girl no one wanted, the child who had frightened rather than delighted, the person who had learned that the only safety available was in becoming so exceptional that dismissal became impossible. She carried this wound into her professional life with the same efficiency she brought to everything, which meant it was invisible in ordinary circumstances and catastrophically visible in the few circumstances that managed to get past her considerable defences. She rose quickly through the ranks of the Brotherhood, which was the best and worst outcome for someone with her particular architecture. Success confirmed her strategy and offered no reason to revise it. By the time she was fully established as a sorceress of significant power and significant reputation, she had constructed around herself a persona of such thorough competence and controlled authority that the people who worked with her routinely forgot or never knew that underneath the control was someone who had never quite forgiven the world for what her beginning had been. She and Geralt met on a road outside a town called Rinda, which is the kind of meeting that begins with conflict and ends with something much more difficult to categorize. He was there on a contract. She was there because mages go where mages go, which is generally wherever their interests direct them without consulting the convenience of the people already in those locations. The specific circumstances of their initial encounter are complicated by the fact that a djinn was involved, one of the continent's most dangerous and most wished-for magical entities, a creature of extraordinary power capable of granting wishes in ways that are technically accurate, and therefore frequently catastrophic. Geralt found the djinn first. He made 2 wishes, the specifics of which are not entirely clear in any account and were never fully explained by Geralt himself, who had the Witcher's characteristic reluctance to discuss the things that mattered most to him in terms that might communicate how much they mattered. The 3rd wish, the last wish, the one that would seal the djinn's obligation and exhaust its power, was the one that determined everything that followed. Yennefer was dying. This is the simple version, which has the virtue of being true while omitting the considerably complicated events that produced the situation. She was dying in circumstances that Geralt had either contributed to or could have prevented, depending on which account you credit, and Geralt made his final wish in a way that saved her. The djinn's power wrapped around what he wished for, and the wish took, and Yennefer lived. What Geralt wished for is another thing he never explained clearly, and perhaps did not fully understand himself, because what happened in the aftermath of the wish suggests that whatever he said to the djinn in that moment was more complicated than a simple request to preserve a life. The 2 of them were bound by it afterward in a way that neither of them could fully explain or fully escape. Not bound by magic in a simple or clean sense, not bound the way a spell binds, but bound in the more honest sense of 2 people who cannot stop coming back to each other, even when every reasonable assessment of the situation suggests they should try harder to stay apart. Their relationship across the years that followed was not what either of them would have chosen if choosing had been freely available. It was interrupted constantly by their respective professional obligations, by political situations that required mages and witches to be in different places, by the genuine and somewhat catastrophic differences in how each of them understood intimacy and obligation, and the proper management of vulnerability. They were not easy together. They were also, when they were together, more fully themselves than either managed to be separately, which is the particular evidence that the people who know them cite when asked whether what happened between them was real. Yennefer wanted a child. This is something she carried throughout her adult life with an honesty about the wanting that her professional persona did not allow for most things. A raw and undefended admission of what the transformation that had made her powerful had simultaneously taken from her. She pursued every available avenue. She consulted texts and scholars and other sorceresses who had made similar attempts. She found, as all of them found, that the sterility produced by magical training was not a puzzle with a solution, but a wall with no door in it. This is the shape of her when Ciri arrives, a sorceress of formidable capability in a complicated long-term relationship with a witcher who is incapable of being uncomplicated about anything, carrying an unresolved grief about what she cannot have, brilliant and fierce and far more fragile in the exact centre than the exterior suggests. When the girl with the elder blood and the mane of ashen hair and the speed of someone who has learned to move through chaotic situations arrives in her life, something in Yennefer recognizes something in Ciri that does not require explanation or deliberation. She becomes Ciri's teacher. More than that. She becomes what she had concluded she would never become, and the having of it does not resolve the grief about the path to it, but sits alongside the grief in the way that real things sit alongside the wounds that preceded them, both true, both present, neither cancelling the other. Let her image soften in your mind now. The sorceress with violet eyes and dark hair, standing at the threshold of something she did not expect. the night settling in around all of them. Let your breathing slow to match the quiet. The chapters of Yennefer's career between her graduation from Aretusa and her encounter with Geralt are chapters of considerable political sophistication and considerable personal cost. She served as the advisor to the Court of Eden for a period that established her reputation for both capability and difficulty, the capability being well documented and the difficulty being a characterization that concealed a simpler fact. She disagreed with people in power when she believed they were wrong, which is not a form of difficulty but a form of integrity, though the two are often confused by the people on the receiving end of it. Her relationship with the Brotherhood of Sorcerers was always slightly outside of its centre, which was partly a matter of temperament and partly a matter of the particular way she had arrived at her power, through a transformation that was more total and more personal than most of her colleagues' histories, and that had left her with a different relationship to the institution's assumptions about how sorcerers were supposed to understand themselves. She was not an outsider, not exactly, but she occupied the position of someone who had been inside long enough to see the institution clearly, and had not adjusted her vision to match what the institution preferred to see about itself. The Djinn encounter, which brought her and Geralt into the same crisis for the first time, was not the first time either of them had dealt with complications arising from magical entities of significant and unpredictable power. But it was the occasion that produced between them something that subsequent events would test repeatedly, and that proved, with each test, more durable than either of them had anticipated when they first discovered it. There is a kind of bond that forms between people who have been through something genuinely dangerous together and managed it. Not a romantic bond necessarily, not even a friendship necessarily, but a specific recognition of how the other person responds when circumstances remove the social performance and leave only the actual person. What Yennefer and Geralt recognized in each other in the aftermath of the Djinn was something that neither of them was prepared for and neither of them managed in the moment to do anything particularly useful with. Your breathing is slower now. Feel that. Feel the difference between the breath you drew at the beginning of this journey and the breath you're drawing now. Easier, deeper, less effortful. The breath of a body that has remembered it is allowed to rest. The world we are moving through is growing heavier with politics tonight, with the weight of empires and their appetites, but let that weight settle around you like a blanket rather than pressing down on you. You are outside it. You're watching from a comfortable distance from the warmth of this late hour as the large wheels of history turn. The continent on which all of this occurs is not a single political entity, and has never attempted to be one. It is a collection of smaller kingdoms that share a geographic space and a general cultural heritage rooted in the Nordling human traditions brought through the conjunction, but which have spent the centuries since the conjunction defining themselves primarily in opposition to one another. The northern kingdoms, as they are collectively called, include Redania, Temeria, Aedirn, Cadwen, Skellige in its island configuration, and the smaller polities like Sintra that exist in the contested margins between the larger powers. Each of these kingdoms has its own crown, its own nobility, its own merchant class and peasantry in relationship to the magical community, its own specific grievances with its neighbours and its own specific ambitions for the territory those neighbours currently occupy. The politics of the North are not random, but they are dense, requiring years of study to navigate even theoretically, and the people who live within them tend to develop a resigned familiarity with the fact that the arrangements above their heads are always in the process of rearranging themselves, and that the rearrangements rarely benefit the people who are not doing the arranging. South of the Yaruga River, across the natural boundary that separates the northern kingdoms from the territories below, lies the Nilfgaardian Empire. Nilfgaard is not like the northern kingdoms in any respect that makes them comprehensible through a northern framework. It is older, or at least it understands itself as older, its cultural and political institutions rooted in traditions that predate the northern kingdom's formation, and that carry the self-assurance of something that has not yet needed to question its own legitimacy, because its longevity has served as sufficient argument. The Emperor of Nilfgaard during the period that most concerns this story is Emhyr var Emreis, and Emhyr var Emreis is one of those historical figures whose presence in events is so pervasive and so decisive that understanding what happened requires understanding him, even from a distance, even in the compressed form that a story told for the late hours of the night can manage. He was not, by any of the accounts that survive him, a simple man. He was a sophisticated man who had experienced significant suffering, who'd been removed from power and restored to it through circumstances so extraordinary that they read as mythological, and who had organized his entire governing philosophy around a single conviction, that the world would be better if Nilfgaard ran it. This conviction was held without cruelty in its foundational form, which is perhaps the most unsettling thing about it. Emhyr did not want to conquer the North because he wanted to punish the North. He wanted to conquer it because he believed, with the patient certainty of someone who has thought about a problem from every angle for a very long time, that Nilfgaardian order and Nilfgaardian stability and Nilfgaardian administration would produce better outcomes for the people living under them than the chaotic arrangements those people currently occupied. He was wrong about this in ways that any of those people could have explained to him if he'd been interested in their explanation, which he was not because he had already completed the analysis and did not require correction. The first Nilfgaardian war against the northern kingdoms ended at the Battle of Sodden Hill, a confrontation that became one of the defining mythological events in northern culture, the moment the kingdoms held together against an overwhelming force. The mages played a decisive role at Sodden Hill, the Brotherhood deploying its magical capabilities in a coordinated way that the Nilfgaardian forces had not adequately anticipated, and the cost to the Brotherhood was significant, multiple mages dying in the defence in ways that left their mark on the institution and on the individuals who survived. Sit with the weight of what a war between kingdoms actually means. Not the battles, not the strategy, but the texture of it in the daily life of the people who are not doing the fighting, but are living through it. The roads become dangerous in ways they were already dangerous, but now in a more organised and less predictable fashion. The crop cycles are disrupted when the men who would have harvested them are elsewhere. The villages nearest the contested zones empty in both directions at once, the refugees going north away from the advancing armies, and the conscripts going south toward them, the two streams of people passing each other on roads that neither has chosen to be on. Geralt moves through all of this. This is important to understand about his position in the political landscape. He is not a partisan. He's not a Nilfgaardian sympathiser and not a northern loyalist. He is a witcher, which means he is someone who serves whoever pays him within the limits of what he is willing to do, and whose deepest commitments are not to kingdoms or flags, but to the specific people in his personal orbit, and to the general principle of not making things worse. In a world organised around loyalty to one side or another, this makes him difficult to classify, which is itself sometimes a useful thing to be, and sometimes a genuinely dangerous thing to be. The second Nilfgaardian war, which comes after Geralt has found Ciri, and the small improbable family at the centre of this story has formed itself around that finding, is the conflict that makes everything else more urgent. Emir Var Emreis moves north again with armies that have learned from the First War's ending. The northern kingdoms are divided in the way that coalitions assembled under external pressure tend to become divided once the external pressure temporarily recedes, and division makes them less able to resist what is coming from the south. But Emir's interest in Ciri is not merely strategic. This is where the story becomes more entangled than a simple account of imperial expansion can contain. Ciri carries the Elder Blood, and the Elder Blood is of deep and specific interest to Nilfgaard's intelligence apparatus, and to certain figures within it who understand what the power she carries could mean in the context of dynastic ambition. An heir with the Elder Blood would be an heir of extraordinary magical and political significance, capable of things that no ordinary heir could be capable of. The empire that secured such an heir, and the right to that heir's power and bloodline, would hold something irreplaceable. The world that Geralt has spent decades navigating on the basis of carefully limited personal commitments has closed around him. He cannot be uninvolved in the wars of kings when one of those kings is sending agents specifically for the girl he has come to think of as his daughter. He cannot hold his comfortable philosophical distance from the large political events, when the large political events have decided to develop an interest in his specific domestic arrangements. Lesser evil as a philosophy requires that you remain capable of identifying which evil is lesser, and that identification becomes considerably more difficult when the person you love most is the currency being exchanged. The mages are also moving through this period in their own complicated directions. The Brotherhood of Sorcerers is not a unified body in the way that its name suggests. Its members have individual relationships with individual kingdoms, serve individual rulers, have individual opinions about Nilfgaard and the North, and the appropriate response to the pressure the war is placing on the continent's magical community. Some have already aligned themselves with Nilfgaard, some remain with the Northern cause, some are pursuing their own agendas in the margins of the conflict, which is perhaps the most mage-like response available. Yennefer is arrested at one point during these events, held by forces whose interest in her is partly political and partly something else, partly connected to the knowledge she carries and the student she has taken on, and what both of those things mean in the context of a war that is as much about magical inheritance as it is about territory. Her imprisonment is another thread in the tapestry of separations and reunions that the war weaves around Geralt and Ciri, another instance of the world's tendency to take from Geralt the things he has decided matter to him and force him to recover them through circumstances that would break someone with less ingrained stubbornness. The Skoya tale, the non-human guerrilla fighters, add another dimension to the conflict that cannot be reduced to the simple North versus South framing. The elves and dwarves and other elder races have their own reasons for preferring either outcome, reasons rooted in centuries of displacement and cultural loss, and the slow erosion of everything that predated human expansion. Some have aligned with Nilfgaard, calculating that the Empire's willingness to offer them autonomy within its structure is more favourable than the Northern Kingdom's long history of active hostility. Others resist all external alignment and fight for their own accounts in the forests and margins where the war passes but does not fully reach. Through all of this, through the burning roads and the political calculations and the armies moving across a landscape that will remember their passage for generations, the small story at the centre continues. A witcher, a sorceress, a girl with silver hair and eyes that see sideways into other times. They are not kings. They are not armies. They cannot change the outcome of battles or redirect the ambitions of empires through any direct action available to them. What they can do, and what they do is hold on to each other with a stubbornness that the political world finds inconvenient, and that the three of them have decided is the primary obligation they hold. Let the war grow distant now. Let it recede to the middle distance where large things go when they are not your immediate concern. The night is very quiet at this hour. Whatever is happening in the large world is happening somewhere else. Where you are is safe and still, and the story is moving toward something gentler than armies. Rest toward it. The Battle of Brenna, which came during the Second Nilfgaardian War, was one of the decisive engagements of the conflict and is worth understanding as an example of how the wars of this period were actually fought and what they actually cost. The northern forces, under commanders who had learned from the First War's failures, chose ground that neutralized some of Nilfgaard's advantages in cavalry and logistics, and managed to inflict losses significant enough to shift the trajectory of the campaign. The victory was real, but it was not clean, and the aftermath of the battle had the particular quality of aftermath that belongs to conflicts large enough that the resolution of the military question does not resolve the human one. The refugees that the Second War generated moved through the continent in numbers that placed pressure on every settlement along the major routes north. The systems that ordinary life depends on, the supply chains and the market networks and the relationships between farming community and the towns that bought their surplus, were disrupted in ways that took years to repair and in some regions never fully returned to their pre-war configuration. The people most harmed by this disruption were, as is almost always the case, the people with the fewest resources to absorb it, the rural poor, the itinerant workers, the communities that had been marginal even before the war added its specific burdens to their existing ones. Geralt's navigation of the political landscape during the Second War involved a series of decisions, each individually explicable and in combination revealing of a consistent underlying priority. The specific people he was committed to protecting took precedence over every abstract political alignment that the war offered. This was not a popular position in a world organized around the expectation that individuals would declare themselves for one side or another, and it generated frustration among people on both sides of the conflict, who believed that capability of Geralt's level should be deployable in service of their particular cause. He remained, through all of this frustration, consistent in the way that only people with a clearly articulated internal priority can remain consistent when the external pressure to abandon it is sustained. The hour is very late now. You may not be fully awake, and that is entirely as it should be. Let this story reach you in whatever state you are in, because the stories that find us at the threshold of sleep have a way of becoming part of us more completely than the stories we receive in full wakefulness. You do not need to hold on to what you hear. Simply let it move through you. The warmth of where you are is real. The quiet is real. And in the distance, if you listen past the quiet, you might almost hear the sound of riders. The sound does not come from the world you live in. It comes from somewhere much older and much colder, and moving across the sky in a way that hoofbeats have no business moving. The wild hunt has been part of the folklore of the continent for longer than the oldest grandmother's oldest story can account for. One of those presences in the cultural imagination that people refer to without quite being able to explain where the reference originated. Red-eyed riders on spectral horses, crossing the night sky in formation, an omen of winter and death and things taken from the living in the night. The truth behind the wild hunt is more complicated and more interesting than the folklore version, as true things tend to be. The riders are real. They are elves, specifically the Ainel, the elves of another world, a world to which the connections created by the conjunction of the spheres still, in some attenuated form exist. They travel between worlds using corridors that the Elder Blood can open, moving through the between places that separate one sphere of reality from another, hunting in other worlds and returning to their own with whatever they have taken. What they take primarily are people, specifically people whose life force, when harvested in certain ways, can power the journeys between worlds that sustain the NL's capacity to exist as they wish to exist, as a people who move between realities rather than being confined to any single one. This is a transactional relationship with other people's lives that the NL have organized into a practical necessity rather than a moral question, which tells you something important about how a civilization can accommodate practices that would, from outside, appear indefensible. Their king is Eredin Break Glass, a figure of considerable military genius and considerably limited empathy, who commands the Wild Hunt's riders with an efficiency that reflects his understanding of the hunt not as a mythological phenomenon, but as a logistical operation. Eredin is not a villain in the simple sense of someone who enjoys causing suffering. He is something more precisely troubling. A leader who causes suffering instrumentally, as the byproduct of achieving objectives that his own framework of values has established as legitimate. This is, if you think about it at sufficient length, a more common kind of dangerous than the simple kind. The NLA wants Ciri specifically. This is not incidental to their campaign across the continent in the years that concern this story. It is the campaign. Ciri's Elder Blood gives her the capacity to open the corridors between worlds not as a trained skill requiring years of practice, but as something closer to a natural function, something her blood knows how to do in the way that blood knows how to clot around a wound. The corridors she could open, if the NL could direct and control her ability, would allow the Wild Hunt's riders to travel between worlds with a freedom and a range that no other method available to them could provide. She represents, in the calculus of the NL's leadership, the solution to the primary constraint on their civilization's ambitions. And in the calculus of Geralt and Yennefer, she represents the person they have organized their lives around protecting, which means the Wild Hunt is not an abstract problem or a political complication, but a direct and continuing threat to the thing they have decided is most important to them. Geralt encounters the Wild Hunt across multiple points in his history, in ways that escalate from indirect and atmospheric to direct and costly. The first encounters are more impression than confrontation, the sense of something vast and cold paying attention, the aftermath of places where the hunt has passed through like weather, leaving evidence of their presence in the form of emptiness. Later, the confrontations are more direct, and the riders are more willing to engage him when he is between them and what they want. There is a moment, one of the defining moments in Geralt's history, where he is taken by the Wild Hunt, and the taking costs him something irreplaceable. Time. Years. The hunt does not kill him because killing him is less useful than using him, and he spends a period that feels, from the inside, like a relatively short captivity, but which, when he returns to the world he left, reveals itself through the simple arithmetic of how much everyone he knows has aged, while he experienced barely anything of the same passage. He returns to the world from this captivity without his memories. This is the cruelest detail, and the one that generates the most suffering in the years immediately following, not the memory loss itself, which is simply an absence, but the process of recovering those memories, piece by piece, encounter by encounter, finding out what he was and what he had, and what he had said, and what he had valued by seeing the evidence of all of it in the people who remembered it when he did not. He is a man reading the history of himself from the faces of the people he encounters, and some of what he reads there is wonderful and some of it is devastating. Ciri, during the period of Geralt's captivity and memory loss, is making her own history in places and circumstances that Geralt is not present for, cannot be present for, and will spend considerable time afterward trying to find and understand. She moves through several different worlds during this period, not metaphorically but literally, travelling through the corridors that her blood opens in moments of extremity. She encounters peoples and geographies that no person from the continent has ever encountered, accumulates experiences that mark her in ways both visible and invisible, becomes, during this period of enforced independence, more fully and more irrevocably herself. She becomes a fighter of genuine skill, not the carefully trained and structured skill that formal Witcher training would have produced, but something more improvisational, and therefore in some ways more adaptable, built from encounters with genuine danger and genuine consequence rather than from drills in a fortress courtyard. She develops her ability to navigate the between places, with a growing confidence that does not eliminate the danger of those transits, but does reduce the likelihood that they will kill her through misadventure. She also carries the psychological cost of the period, the loneliness of it, the experience of being hunted across multiple realities by something that wanted her for what she could provide rather than who she was. The Wild Hunt's pursuit of Ciri is the kind of sustained threat that leaves marks even on people who successfully evade it, a constant background awareness that nowhere is entirely safe and no relationship can be entirely straightforward when there is something that powerful looking for you. The cost of the Wild Hunt to this story is most clearly visible not in any single catastrophic event, but in the accumulated weight of what the three people at the centre of the story lose to it and spend trying to recover. Time, memory, presence, the ordinary continuity of a family's daily life that the world's political and supernatural complexity keeps interrupting before it can fully establish itself. They want something very simple, a place that is safe and warm and theirs. The Wild Hunt is the most dramatic representative of the large, cold forces that find this simple desire inconvenient. But here is what the Wild Hunt, for all its cold power and its riders who move across the sky like something from the worst part of a dream, cannot ultimately do. It cannot take from Ciri the fact of who she chose to be, the decisions she made about what she owed to the world she moved through and to the people she had gathered around her as her own. It can pursue her. It can threaten her. It can separate her from the people she loves. What it cannot do is make her someone other than herself. This is not a small thing. In a world where extraordinary power is always looking for extraordinary capability to exploit, the most profound resistance available to the person being pursued is to remain recognizably themselves through the pursuit. Ciri manages this, unevenly and imperfectly and with significant cost, the way all genuine forms of resistance are managed, without guaranteed outcomes and without the comfort of certainty, but with a consistency that adds up over time to something that the word surviving does not quite capture. Let the riders recede into the dark now. Let the sound of hooves on nothing, on the cold air itself, fade back into the distance where it began. The night you're in is safe. The hunt is moving elsewhere. And somewhere, in the warmth of a place that is not entirely real, and not entirely a dream, a witcher and a sorceress are waiting for the person they lost to come home. Breathe slowly. The homecoming is very close. The between places that Ciri learned to navigate during her years of diaspora from the people she considered her family are described in the accounts she gave later in her life as having a quality entirely unlike any other kind of space she'd ever inhabited. They were not dark exactly, but the light in them did not come from a source she could identify. They were not cold exactly, but the temperature in them was not the temperature of a living world. It was more neutral than that, more suspended, as though the usual conditions of physical existence were present in them only as a formality rather than as something genuinely operative. The NLS world, which Ciri saw during one of her transits, and which Eredin moved through as his native territory, was extraordinary in ways that were simultaneously beautiful and deeply wrong for someone from a different sphere of reality. Its architecture was grander than anything on the continent, built by a people with a longer history of settled civilization and a different relationship to materials and scale. But it had the quality of grandeur that belongs to things built without joy, impressive in dimensions and hollow in the way that spaces become hollow when the life has gone out of them and only the structure remains. Geralt's recovery of his memories, after his return from the Wild Hunt's captivity, was not a linear process, and not a comfortable one. The memories returned in fragments, triggered by encounters with people and places and objects that his altered neurology recognized even when his conscious mind did not. He would meet someone he had known for years and feel the recognition before the specific content of the history between them arrived. A strange doubling of experience where the emotional truth of a relationship preceded its factual reconstruction. He learned to trust the emotional recognition more than he might have expected to, discovering that the feelings the mutations had supposedly suppressed were apparently more durably encoded than the narrative memories they were supposed to accompany. The spectral horses of the Wild Hunt, which the folklore of the continent described with a consistency that suggested either a genuine observed phenomenon or a very widely distributed shared imagining, moved between worlds the way that certain birds move between seasons, with a purposefulness that implied a destination known in advance, and a route that was neither arbitrary nor entirely visible to anyone not already moving along it. The riders themselves appeared in accounts from every region of the continent, and from the scattered historical records of other worlds that Ciri encountered during her period of diaspora, suggesting that the hunt's range was genuinely as vast as the mythology claimed, covering not just the continent, but a span of realities that made the continent look like a single room in a very large building. Geralt's experience of captivity with the Wild Hunt left him with a relationship to time that was different from the one he had developed before it. He had always understood time as something that accumulated behind you in a way that was invisible while it was happening, and only comprehensible in retrospect. The standard human experience of duration. The captivity introduced a different experience of time as something that could be moved through non-linearly, that the normal relationship between personal duration and calendar duration was a local convention rather than a natural law. He did not use this understanding for any metaphysical purpose. He simply carried it, the way you carry an experience that has permanently changed your sense of what is possible, without offering any clear instruction about what to do with the change. We're very close to the end now, not the end of sleep, which is still coming for you gently and without hurry, but the end of the story that has been carrying you here. Let yourself soften a little more into wherever you are, into the familiar shapes of the dark around you, into the sound of your own slow breathing. This last part of the story is not about battles or empires or ancient magic. It is about something quieter and more essential. It is about what three people built in the space between everything that was trying to take it apart. The word for what Geralt and Yennefer and Ciri became to each other does not translate easily into the ordinary vocabulary of family, because none of the ordinary categories apply without friction. Geralt was not Ciri's father in any biological sense, and was not her guardian in any legal or contractual sense. Yennefer was not her mother, and had not known her since childhood and had come into her life as a teacher before she became anything else. Ciri had lost her actual grandmother and her actual parents in circumstances of genuine violence and genuine finality. And yet, the three of them constituted a family with a completeness that the people who observed them were unable to explain away by pointing at the absence of conventional credentials. They knew each other's specific ways, the particular rhythms of how each of them approached difficulty, the specific things that each of them needed to be reminded of when circumstances eroded the most useful versions of themselves. They irritated each other in the intimate way that requires genuine familiarity, not the surface irritation of strangers in close proximity, but the deeper kind that only arises when you know someone well enough to know exactly which of their habits will produce friction in you, and have not yet managed to stop being produced. Ciri called Geralt a witcher, by way of affectionate deflection, in moments when he was being too controlled and too formal about something that required him to simply be present. He had the witcher's habit of making emotional declarations in the form of practical arrangements, of expressing care through the preparation of things, and the management of logistics rather than through direct statement. She understood this about him, translated it accurately without always letting him know she was doing the translation, because letting him know would have collapsed the mechanism he relied on. He called her a child in moments when he was not ready to acknowledge how fully she'd become something else, something that the category of child could no longer contain. She was faster than him, in certain ways, by the time she was grown, because the elder blood and the experiences she had accumulated had produced a kind of capability that was different from witcher capability, and not simply lesser. He knew this. He acknowledged it in action, in the way he engaged with her training and with her growing autonomy, while maintaining in speech the slightly delayed categorization that parents maintain about the people their children are becoming. Yennefer brought to the three of them the specific quality of competence that the other two occasionally found excessive and consistently relied upon. She was the one who identified problems early enough to address them, rather than simply responding to them once they had become acute. She organized things, not through controlling everything, but through the witcher-like characteristic of thinking several steps ahead, of identifying what the situation would require before the situation arrived at the point of requiring it. Ciri teased her about this. Geralt benefited from it. Sit with this for a moment. The three of them, in a farmhouse in Toussaint, in a ruined inn on a back road, in the recovered keep of Corvo Bianco, existing in the ordinary way of people who have stopped performing for each other and simply inhabit a shared space. The fire going, something cooking, the table with its accumulated evidence of three people's daily life, Geralt's cleaned and laid out tools, Yennefer's books and correspondence, Ciri's training equipment and the occasional abandoned project, a half-fletched arrow, a piece of armour being mended, a letter started and not yet finished. The Hansa, as Geralt's broader company of companions was sometimes called, extended beyond the three of them to include others who had gathered around the centre of their story, through the various intersections of shared experience and mutual necessity. Dandelion, the bard, Geralt's oldest friend, whose talent for being present at significant moments and narrating them afterward in ways that were entertaining and approximately accurate made him simultaneously invaluable and occasionally infuriating. Zoltan Chive, the dwarf warrior, a figure of compact and reliable loyalty. Triss Merigold, a sorceress whose feelings for Geralt were more complicated than simple friendship, and whose care for Ciri was uncomplicated and sincere. These people and others formed around Geralt and his chosen family the way that warmth forms around a fire, not by planning but by proximity, drawn in by the specific quality of what was at the centre. The quality is difficult to articulate and easy to recognise in practice. It is the quality of people who have been through enough together that the performance has been burned away, who are not presenting a version of themselves to each other, but simply being what they are, with the ease that comes from having already been seen in circumstances that would have revealed anything false. Dandelion wrote about Geralt extensively in both his published ballads, where the Witcher became the romantic hero of adventures that Geralt himself found variously accurate and embarrassing, and in his private journals, where the portrait was considerably more nuanced and considerably more honest. What comes through in the private accounts, in the entries written close to events rather than shaped for later presentation, is a consistent astonishment at the gap between the Witcher that the world thought it was dealing with and the Witcher that Dandelion knew. The world thought it was dealing with a mutated professional who'd been engineered to minimize feeling and who had largely succeeded in this minimization. Dandelion knew he was dealing with someone who felt everything, who simply did not express those feelings in the forms that ordinary social convention recognized as feeling. He felt care as a physical urgency that expressed itself as action rather than declaration. He felt loyalty as a non-negotiable premise that did not require articulation because the people who had earned it already knew. He felt love, the specific love he held for Yennefer and for Ciri, as something so fundamental to the architecture of who he had become that removing it would not leave a person with an absence, but would leave an absence with some remnant of a person around it. This is not the emotional profile of someone who has been successfully modified to not feel. This is the emotional profile of someone who learned, in a childhood defined by being given away, and by a youth defined by being remade, that expressing feeling was a liability in a world that had not demonstrated reliable interest in his feelings. The mutations gave him a better mechanism for managing the expression without resolving the underlying fact of what was there to express. He lived in a permanent slight displacement from his own interior life, aware of it, managing it, and in the presence of the people he had chosen, occasionally and briefly reunited with it. The reconciliation between who Geralt was made to be and who Geralt actually was takes place, to the extent that it takes place across the long arc of the relationships he builds rather than in any single redemptive moment. This is how these things actually work, not through the sudden epiphany that stories often prefer, but through the accumulation of decisions made consistently enough over enough time that they become eventually indistinguishable from character. He chose Ciri. He chose Yennefer. He chose the companions who gathered around that centre. He made those choices in circumstances that frequently offered easier alternatives, and then he continued making them when the circumstances changed and the easy alternatives looked more appealing. The question of what Geralt deserved is one that comes up in the accounts of his life with surprising regularity, posed by people trying to understand whether the universe he inhabited was, in any meaningful sense, fair to him. He was made without being asked. He was remade without being asked. He was given a destiny he did not choose, and a family that the world kept trying to separate him from, and a profession that required him to spend his life in service to communities that were ambivalent at best about his existence. The answer the story tends to give, without quite stating it directly, is that what Geralt deserved has less relevance than what Geralt got, which was, in the end, more than the design of his life seemed likely to provide. He got a daughter who thought of him as the truest parent she had ever known. He got a partner of extraordinary capability and genuine depth, who had her own reasons for not expecting to find what she found in him. He got a circle of people who knew him in the specific and irreplaceable way of long familiarity. And he got the particular satisfaction that belongs to people who discover, against their expectations, that they are capable of being known. The night around this family is full of things that have tried to end what they built together, and none of those things have fully succeeded. This is the thing worth carrying from this story into sleep, that what is built with genuine intention and held with genuine stubbornness has a durability that the large forces of the world consistently underestimate. The Empire did not get Ciri. The Wild Hunt did not keep Geralt. The world's opinion of witches did not prevent Geralt from being loved. Let that settle in, quietly, like the last log settling in the fire. It is enough. It is more than enough. The vineyard at Corvo Bianco in Toussaint, which became the closest thing to a permanent home that Geralt ever occupied in his adult life, was a place of considerable improbability for the man who'd spent decades explicitly refusing to accumulate the kind of fixed location that could be used as leverage against him. Toussaint itself was improbable, a duchy organised around wine production, and a culture of chivalric idealism that existed in somewhat implausible cohabitation with its very real political entanglements. A place that had the quality of a world that had decided to take beauty seriously as a primary value and had organised itself accordingly. He became, in Toussaint, something he'd not been before on the continent, a figure with a local reputation that was not simply professional. The people of the region knew him not only as the Witcher who had resolved certain problems in the area, but as the man who lived at Corvo Bianco, whose vineyard produced wine of a quality that surprised the local experts, who could be seen on the roads of the duchy engaged in the ordinary traffic of someone who had decided to inhabit a place rather than simply pass through it. This was a small thing, and a very large thing simultaneously, and the people who knew him from before could see the difference in him, and had different opinions about what it meant. The question of what Geralt passed on to Ciri in the way that parents pass things on, not the genetic material that biological parenthood transmits, but the subtler inheritance of example and expectation, and the specific way of moving through the world that children absorb from the adults they are closest to, is one of the most interesting questions in the whole long accounting of this story. She had his stubbornness, clearly, the kind of stubbornness that presents as a resolution, because it is operating in service of something the person genuinely values rather than simply as an end in itself. She had his habit of expressing care through action rather than declaration. She had, more than either of them initially recognized, his essential philosophical orientation, the conviction that choosing the lesser evil in circumstances that offer no good option is not a failure of ethics, but an exercise of it. We are here now, at the very end of a very long journey. You have travelled across the conjunction of the spheres and through the mountains of Kaer Morhen. You have witnessed the trial of the grasses and the law of surprise and the fall of Cintra. You have watched a sorceress become a mother, and a witcher become a father, and a girl born to elder blood become the centre of a story larger than any kingdom's history. And now you can rest. Fully. The story is told. There is nothing left to carry. Let it all go gently, the way the mind releases what it no longer needs to hold when sleep finally arrives. The man at the centre of this story was designed to feel nothing. This is the central fact around which every other fact arranges itself, the fact that makes all the other facts meaningful. He was designed to feel nothing, and what he turned out to feel was everything, simply in a different language than the one the world used to recognize feeling. He was designed for solitude, and what he built, across decades of roads and contracts and the accumulated weight of a life, lived in the margins of communities he protected without being welcomed into, was a family of extraordinary specificity and extraordinary loyalty. He was designed to be a tool, a useful instrument, something the world could deploy against its monsters and pay and move on from without having to incorporate into the ordinary arrangements of human belonging. And what he became, stubbornly and against every structural incentive available to him, was a person, not a simple person, not a person without cost or contradiction, or the specific kind of damage that comes from being made rather than grown, but a person with preferences and values and a capacity for love that the people who designed him did not build in and could not have removed if they had wanted to. This is not, in the end, a story about monsters. It is a story about what survives the attempt to make something that does not feel. The answer the story gives is everything. Everything survives it. The feelings that were supposed to be engineered away went underground instead, found different expressions, came back in different forms, organized themselves around the specific architecture of who Geralt was rather than the theoretical architecture of what a Witcher was supposed to be. He is proof of something that the world keeps needing to be reminded of, that the interior life cannot be fully managed from the outside. Ciri, in the accounts where she speaks about Geralt as an adult speaking about her childhood, does not describe a cold man. She describes a careful one, a man who thought before he acted with a thoroughness that initially seemed like detachment and revealed itself over time as a form of respect, the respect of taking seriously what you do with the power you have relative to the people around you. She describes a man who was frequently silent in ways that were not empty but full, the silence of someone processing rather than someone absent. She describes a man who was there, consistently and completely, in the ways that being there requires, and that many people manage to avoid by simply being present in the body, while absent everywhere else. Yennefer speaks about him, in the private letters that survive, in ways that suggest she finds him simultaneously comprehensible and inexplicable, which is perhaps the appropriate response to loving someone fully. She understands how he works, the specific mechanisms of how he processes difficulty and expresses care and maintains the commitments he has made. She does not always understand why he is what he is, by which she means she continues to find him genuinely surprising in specific moments, rather than having arrived at the exhausted familiarity that extinguishes surprise entirely. She is, in the letters, a person who has been with someone long enough to know them very well, and has not stopped finding that knowing interesting. Let your eyes be fully closed now. Let the darkness behind them be warm and complete and without demand. There is nothing that needs to happen in this darkness. No problem to solve, no choice to make, no version of yourself to present to anyone. Simply the warmth and the quiet and the breath moving in and out at the slow pace that sleep prefers. The continent is very far away. Kaer Morhen is very far away. The roads where Geralt rode for decades between one contract and the next, and the courts where Yennefer negotiated for her people, and the between places where Ciri learned to move through the corridors of what might have been, all of it is very far away. It is the past, and the past is held now by the present, gently and without effort, the way deep water holds everything that sinks into it. The white wolf is resting. He has put down his swords, both the steel one and the silver one, and they are leaning against the wall of a room that is warm and quiet, and outside the window of that room there is no wild hunt, no Nilfgaardian advance, no political complexity requiring his attention, no monster waiting in the dark beyond the tree line. Just the night, just the ordinary dark that belongs to everyone and threatens no one and asks nothing except that you let it be what it is. This is the gift that the story of Geralt of Rivia offers, if you're willing to receive it in the form it is given rather than the form you might have expected. It does not offer the gift of resolution, of all problems solved and all losses recovered, and all the damage repaired. It offers the gift of endurance, of continuing to choose the things worth choosing in circumstances that provide very little structural support for choosing them. It offers the gift of the family built from wreckage, which is perhaps the most common kind of family there is, and perhaps the most durable. He was never meant to exist, not in the form he took, not with the feelings he had and the choices he made and the people he gathered around himself against every design specification that the trial of the grasses and the expectations of the world had tried to build into him. He was never meant to be a father or a partner or a friend or a person whose absence would leave specific holes in specific lives. He was meant to be useful and safe to use and easily put down when the use was complete. He turned out to be something else entirely, something the world needed more than it needed the useful instrument it had designed. He turned out to be evidence that the person inside the armour, the feeling under the controlled exterior, the love underneath the professional detachment, is always there, always present, always the more truthful version of what a life is actually made of. Let that truth settle through you now like warmth, moving from the surface of the skin down into the deeper places, into the muscles that have been holding themselves tense without noticing, into the places behind the eyes that carry the day's accumulated impressions, into the chest where the breathing happens, slow and full and unhurried now, the way breathing becomes when the body has decided that the night is safe, and that whatever needed to be held through the day can be released into the dark. You have done enough today. Whatever it was, however it went, whatever was managed and whatever was not managed, and whatever remains for tomorrow, you have done enough. The night asks nothing of you except to rest. The morning will arrive with whatever it arrives with, and you will meet it with whatever you meet it with. But that is the morning's concern and not the night's. Tonight you rest. Tonight the story is told and the swords are leaning against the wall and the fire has burned down to embers that give off warmth without light, and the three people at the centre of this story are sleeping too, in whatever form sleep takes for the people who live in old tales, and in the dreams that old tales become when they are carried into the dark hours. Breathe out now. One final, slow exhale that lets the last of whatever was held simply go. There's nothing to hold on to here. The dark is generous. The night is long and quiet and entirely yours. Sleep well. You have travelled a great distance tonight, and the distance was worth it, and now there is nothing left to do but let yourself be carried the rest of the way by the current that has been moving beneath this story from the very beginning, slow and steady and going exactly where you need to go. If you liked this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments. The philosophical tradition of the continent had, by Geralt's era, produced several schools of thought about the nature of monsters and the nature of the humans who fought them. And most of those schools had something interesting to say about the category of being that a witcher occupied. The dominant view, the one that organised the official position of most kingdoms and most institutions, was that witches were tools, elaborate and capable tools shaped by magic and training into a specific function, but tools in the essential sense of things whose value was defined by their usefulness to others rather than by any intrinsic worth. This view was comfortable for the people who held it because it resolved the ethical complications that would arise from treating as merely instrumental something that had the full cognitive and emotional complexity of a person. The alternative view, held by a minority of scholars, and by most of the people who had actually known a Witcher well rather than simply employed one, was that the mutations produced something new rather than something diminished, a kind of being that was not quite the same as an unmodified human, but was not less than one, simply differently constituted, differently organized around different capabilities and different vulnerabilities. This view was less comfortable because it required extending to witchers the full moral consideration that persons merit, and the history of interactions between witchers and the societies they served was not a history that supported comfortable extension of that consideration. What Geralt embodied, and what the story of his life demonstrates with a completeness that no theoretical argument could achieve, was that the question of whether witches deserve to be treated as persons was always the wrong question. The right question was what the treatment of witches revealed about the people doing the treating, about the willingness or unwillingness of human beings to extend moral consideration past the boundaries of what was familiar to them. Geralt was always a person. The world's difficulty in recognizing this was always the world's problem to resolve. He lived his life as though the resolution was already complete, as though the recognition was already given, and in doing so he made the recognition gradually more available to the people who encountered him over the long course of his years. The ballads that Dandelion wrote about Geralt over the course of their friendship range from the genuinely moving to the genuinely embarrassing, which is probably the right range for an honest account of anyone's life. The ones that endured longest in the popular imagination were not the most dramatically constructed or the most musically sophisticated, but the ones that caught something true about the man at their centre, a quality of quiet stubbornness, of choosing again and again the harder option because the harder option was the one consistent with who he had decided to be. These ballads found audiences in places that surprised Dandelion, not just in the courts and the inns of the northern kingdoms, but in the borderlands and the frontier settlements, the places where people lived in closest proximity to the kind of danger that made a witch's existence comprehensible rather than abstract. The road that Geralt travelled is still there, not the specific roads, which are mud and stone and subject to the ordinary erosion of time and weather and the indifference of the kingdoms that maintain them, but the kind of road, the road that exists between one place and the next, between the settled world and the wild places at its edges, between the life you were given and the life you chose, that road is still there. It exists in every place where someone is moving through something difficult towards something uncertain, carrying what they have and keeping faith with the people they have decided to keep faith with, not because the outcome is guaranteed, but because the keeping is the point. Geralt of Rivia walked that road for a very long time. He walked it very well. Let his walking carry you now, all the way down, into the deep quiet where the night holds everything,